Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
The deep forest is a different place at night. Shadows stretch impossibly long, and the silence isn't really silence at all, just an eerie absence of anything human. That's what Nathan kept telling himself as he trudged through the dense undergrowth, his flashlight beam cutting a weak path through the darkness. The nearest town was miles away, and his phone had lost signal hours ago. But the worst part? He wasn't supposed to be out here. Earlier that day, he had overheard 2 local hikers at a gas station talking about an abandoned cabin deep in the forest, one that wasn't on any map. Curiosity had gotten the best of him. He had parked his truck near the old trailhead and started walking. By the time he realized the sun was dipping below the trees, the way back seemed different. The markers he swore he had followed were gone. That was the first time he felt it. Something watching him. It started as a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, then a subtle shift in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The flashlight flickered. He smacked it, and it steadied, but when he lifted it again, something had moved in the periphery of the beam. A shape, low to the ground, crouching. Nathan froze. His first thought was that it was a wild animal, maybe a bear or a coyote, but the way it moved, slow, deliberate, was all wrong. It wasn't sniffing the air or darting away like startled wildlife. It was watching him, stalking. He took a step back and the undergrowth rustled. The thing shifted with him. He couldn't see it fully, just the suggestion of something humanoid, too thin, too elongated. The flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, the thing was closer, much closer. Panic set in. Nathan turned and ran. Branches tore at his arms and face. Roots threatened to trip him. The deeper he went, the more he felt the presence closing in, heavy breaths that weren't his own, the sound of something crawling fast on all fours. His lungs burned and his legs screamed for rest, but stopping wasn't an option. Then the trees thinned, a clearing, and there it was, the cabin. Weathered wood, a collapsed porch, a door barely hanging on its hinges. Nathan sprinted inside, slamming the door behind him. He backed away, scanning the room with his dying flashlight. Dust motes hung in the air, undisturbed for years. The furniture was rotted, the smell of damp wood thick in his nostrils. A skittering sound echoed from outside. Not footsteps, something else. Fingernails dragging along the wooden walls. Nathan clamped a hand over his mouth, forcing himself to stay silent. The noise circled the cabin, slow and methodical, as if whatever was out there was deciding what to do with him. Then the whispering started. At first, he thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. But no, this was different. Low, urgent, dozens of voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. They rose and fell, overlapping each other, coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to wake up. A sudden weight pressed against the door. The wood groaned. Something was pushing. No, not pushing, pressing its face against it. The shape of a mouth stretched unnaturally wide, lips peeling back over too many teeth. Nathan stumbled away. His foot hit something, an old trapdoor near the fireplace. He dropped to his knees, yanking it open. A ladder descended into darkness. No time to think. The door behind him began to crack. He climbed down, landing in a cold earthen tunnel. The whispers grew louder. He turned, raising his flashlight, and nearly dropped it. The tunnel stretched into the distance, and lining the walls were figures. Hundreds of them. Pale, emaciated bodies, eyes sunken and lifeless, mouths stretched into soundless screams. They were frozen in place, their arms reaching out as if clawing for escape. The whispering wasn't coming from them. It was coming from behind him. Nathan turned, and the last thing he saw before the flashlight flickered out was something stepping toward him from the darkness, something that had been waiting for him all along.
Story number 2.
Sarah had always been the adventurous type. So when her friends dared her to explore the old abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town, she couldn't resist. The place had been deserted for decades, but the rumors, oh, the rumors, kept people talking. They said the asylum was cursed, that the patients who had died there never left, their souls trapped in the decaying walls. It was just past midnight when Sarah arrived. The full moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the crumbling structure. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay. The entrance was wide open, as if inviting her in, but that wasn't what unsettled her. No, it was the strange silence, the kind that pressed in on you, making your skin crawl as though the world had forgotten how to make noise. She stepped over the threshold, the heavy wooden doors creaking behind her. The floorboards groaned under her weight, and her flashlight flickered, sending shadows darting across the walls. She paused for a moment, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up, but shrugged it off as nerves. The asylum was dark, far darker than the moonlight outside could ever penetrate. Her footsteps echoed in the stillness as she walked down the narrow hallway, each door along the way tightly shut. The air grew colder as she moved deeper into the building, but there was something else, something more unsettling, a feeling that she wasn't alone. The temperature dropped even further as she reached the end of the hall, and that's when she heard it, a soft rustling sound, like clothing brushing against the floor. Then a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from the room to her left. Sarah stepped forward, heart pounding in her chest. She raised her flashlight, the beam shaking as it cut through the darkness. The whispering stopped, and the silence returned, thicker than before. She pushed open the door and immediately felt the weight of the room press in on her. Inside, the walls were covered in scribbles, rancid, jagged marks, as though someone had clawed at the stone with their bare hands. In the far corner stood a rocking chair, slowly moving back and forth as if it had been occupied only moments before. But there was no one there. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, low and hoarse. "Why are you here?" Sarah froze, the words crawling up her spine like icy fingers. She swung the flashlight around, but there was no one to be seen. Her breath came out in sharp bursts as her eyes scanned the room. It was empty. She was alone. The voice came again, this time louder, closer. "Get out!" The light flickered, and in that instant, she saw it. Just a blur, a flash of something moving in the corner of the room. A figure hunched and misshapen, with eyes that reflected the weak beam of her flashlight. The air turned heavy, suffocating. Sarah's heartbeat thundered in her chest as she backed toward the door. But as she did, the room seemed to shift. The door wasn't where it had been. It was farther down the hall now, impossibly far. She spun around, disoriented, and found herself facing a different hallway altogether. Then the whispers returned, thousands of them, all at once, filling the air like a swarm of insects. "You shouldn't have come," they hissed. "You shouldn't have come." A cold gust of air swept past her, slamming the door shut behind her. She whipped around to face it, but when she turned back to the hallway, the walls were closing in on her. Her flashlight flickered and died, leaving her in the absolute black. The whispers grew louder, then silent, and just as Sarah's panic hit its peak, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, approached from the darkness. She wasn't alone. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She turned to run but stumbled, tripping over something soft. She screamed and looked down. A hand, pale, skeletal, was reaching up from the floor, its fingers scraping against her legs. Her body went rigid with terror, unable to move, unable to escape as the hand dragged itself upward. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw before everything went black were the pale faces of the patients, their hollow eyes staring up at her from the walls, from the floor, from the very air. When they found her the next morning, Sarah was gone. Not a trace remained. The only thing they could find was the sound of faint whispers, carried on the wind, as if they were still calling her name. And the asylum, it stood silent once more.
Story number 3.
It was late when Greg finally made his way down the winding dirt road toward the old cabin. The weather had turned unexpectedly, and what started as a simple weekend getaway with friends had morphed into a desperate scramble for shelter. His friends had insisted on taking a hike through the woods to find the best view of the lake. But the storm had come out of nowhere, and by the time Greg reached the clearing, they were nowhere to be found. His phone had no signal. The cabin, which had once seemed charming in the daylight, now looked like something pulled straight from a nightmare. The windows were shattered, the door slightly ajar, and the entire structure leaned at an odd angle, as though it had been forgotten by time itself. Still, it was the only place with a roof within miles. Greg pushed the door open, and the hinges groaned in protest. The interior smelled of mold and mildew, the air thick with the stale scent of neglect. The place had been abandoned for years, and yet there was something about it that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was too quiet, unnaturally still. He took a step inside, but before he could even take a deep breath, he heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, he thought it was a trick of the wind, or maybe the rain against the roof. But no, the sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. It came from upstairs, where a narrow staircase led to a second-floor landing. Greg's stomach twisted in discomfort, but he figured it was probably just an animal or some old creaky floorboards. Still, the hair on his neck prickled. With an uneasy glance toward the stairs, Greg moved further into the cabin, hoping to find something, anything, that might help him get his bearings. He made his way through the living room, passing a set of dusty armchairs and an old fireplace, its stones covered in a thick layer of soot. Then he noticed something strange on the floor, a line of small circular objects, coins perhaps, arranged in a perfect circle. But these weren't coins, not exactly. They looked too old, their surfaces worn smooth, almost polished by time. Each one was inscribed with strange symbols, unfamiliar markings that made Greg's stomach churn with unease. The tapping sound continued. It was louder now, closer. Against his better judgment, Greg's feet moved toward the staircase. He hadn't come this far to turn back without understanding what was going on. Slowly, step by step, he ascended. The air grew colder with each movement, and the floorboards creaked under his weight. When he reached the top, he paused, straining his ears. The tapping was now more of a scratching sound, like claws scraping against wood. Greg crept down the hallway. The door to the bedroom was slightly open, the frame warped from years of weather damage. He pushed it open with a reluctant hand, and there, in the middle of the room, was something that shouldn't have been there. A large, round mirror. It stood against the far wall, cracked down the center, and the glass gleamed with a strange, unnatural light. The room was otherwise empty, but the feeling of being watched hung heavy in the air. The tapping grew frantic, almost desperate, and Greg's heart hammered in his chest. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. His eyes darted back to the mirror, and that's when he saw it. In the reflection, something was moving. A figure, distorted and hunched, standing behind him. Greg whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just silence. But the mirror told a different story. The figure was closer now, its shape clearer. It had pale, sickly skin, its limbs too long, its face twisted with a grotesque grin. It was reaching out, its fingers stretching unnaturally toward Greg's reflection. The figure in the mirror began to smile wider, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It stepped forward, out of the reflection, and into the room. Greg stumbled backward, his pulse racing. He slammed the door shut behind him, but the mirror, the reflection, didn't stop. The figure followed. It was closer now, just inches away from Greg. He could hear its breath, slow and shallow, like a rasping wheeze in the darkness. The last thing he saw was the reflection of its twisted hand reaching for his neck. Then, everything went black. When the search party found the cabin the next day, it was empty, save for a few scattered belongings and the strange circle of symbols on the floor. They found Greg's phone, its screen cracked, and they found his backpack near the back door. But Greg was never found. The mirror, however, remained. No one knows how or why, but the scratches on the glass are still visible, faintly glowing in the right light. If you look closely enough, you might catch a glimpse of something behind you, something waiting. And if you listen long enough, you might hear the tapping begin again.
Story number 4.
Eli had always been a skeptic. Ghost stories, paranormal sightings, he'd brushed them off as fantasy and exaggeration. So when his friends dragged him to a supposedly haunted mansion on the outskirts of town, he was less than enthusiastic. They had heard rumors about the old Whitmore estate, tales of a tragic family death, strange sounds in the middle of the night, and sightings of ghostly figures in the windows. But to Eli, it was all just a bunch of superstition. It was a cold night in October, the kind of chill that sank deep into your bones. The mansion loomed ahead, its dark silhouette barely visible against the darkening sky. The gates creaked open slowly as they pushed their way through, and Eli felt a weird sense of unease, though he chalked it up to the growing darkness. His friends, on the other hand, were excited, eager to explore. The estate was massive, A sprawling, decaying mansion with ivy creeping up the sides, windows cracked and broken, and a long, winding staircase that led to the front door. The wind howled through the trees, sending the leaves scattering in every direction. They walked up the stairs and pushed the door open, which groaned in protest as though it hadn't been touched in years. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew filled their nostrils. Eli flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The house was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the faint ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner. It had stopped some time ago, but the movement of the second hand was so faint that Eli almost wondered if it was still running. "We'll go upstairs first," one of his friends said, eager to find something to spook them. They headed up the grand staircase, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Eli trailed behind, his flashlight flickering. As they reached the second floor, the temperature seemed to drop, the air suddenly heavier, as if the house itself was exhaling a long, drawn-out breath. The floorboards creaked under their weight, and Eli felt his skin prickle with a sense of discomfort. The house was silent, too silent. They entered a large bedroom, its four-poster bed covered in a thick layer of dust, curtains billowing slightly in the breeze from the broken window. On the floor near the bed lay a cracked mirror, its glass shards scattered around the room. Eli picked up a shard, examining it carefully. "Looks like someone was in a hurry," he muttered, noting the jagged edges. That's when they heard it, a soft, slow tapping. It started faintly at first, coming from somewhere below them, a rhythmic sound like fingers drumming on wood. It was coming from the first floor. Everyone went still, and the air seemed to thicken, the tapping growing louder. Each tap was like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. Then it stopped. Eli laughed it off, but his friends didn't seem as convinced. "Maybe it's an old pipe or something," he said, trying to dismiss the unease settling in his chest. But before anyone could respond, a door slammed shut somewhere on the floor above them, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. "Okay, maybe we should go," one of his friends suggested, his voice shaky. But Eli, ever the skeptic, urged them to investigate further. They climbed the stairs to the third floor, the steps groaning beneath them with each movement. The hall was narrow, lined with old portraits of grim-faced people whose eyes seemed to follow them as they walked. One of the portraits caught Eli's eye, an older woman, her face stern and cold, her eyes hollow with some kind of sorrow. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about her, something that made his stomach twist. Suddenly, a door at the end of the hall creaked open on its own, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It smelled like dust and decay. The walls were lined with shelves, but they were empty except for a single object placed in the center of the room, a rocking chair. It rocked gently, as though someone had just gotten up. Then the whispering began. At first it was soft, like a distant murmur, but it grew louder, louder until it filled the room. The voices were indistinct, overlapping, a jumble of words that sounded like they were coming from all around them, as though the very walls were speaking. And in the center of the room, the rocking chair continued to move back and forth faster now, as though it were being rocked by invisible hands. Eli's heart raced, his breath shallow. This wasn't a prank, wasn't a trick of the mind. There was something here, something that wasn't quite right. He turned to his friends, but they were already backing away, eyes wide in fear. "We need to get out of here," one of them whispered, panic rising in their voice. As they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them with a force that sent them stumbling forward. The whispering intensified, growing more frantic, the words now clear, although they made no sense. "Leave! Leave! Leave her! She won't let you leave!" The temperature in the room plummeted, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing against them, suffocating them. The rocking chair stopped abruptly, and in its place stood a figure. A woman, pale, gaunt, her eyes black pits of darkness, her mouth stretched into a twisted grin, her long, disheveled hair hung in front of her face like a curtain, and her hands were outstretched, the fingers curling like claws. Before Eli could move, a cold hand wrapped around his wrist, pulling him toward her. The last thing he heard was the whisper, growing louder and louder, until it consumed him entirely. "You're not leaving. No one ever leaves." The friends who had been with Eli that night were never found. The mansion stood empty once more, silent except for the occasional tapping coming from the attic, like a warning to anyone foolish enough to enter. And sometimes when the wind howls through the trees, you might hear a woman's voice calling from the shadows. Leave, leave now.
Story number 5.
The small town of Alderbrook had always been quiet, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. People lived their simple lives without much incident. But that all changed when the old church on the hill was reopened. No one knew why it had been abandoned for so long. The stories surrounding the church were vague, only whispers of strange events, of people who'd entered and never come back, of odd noises heard late at night. But the church was old, historical, and the town had decided it was time to reopen it for the first time in over 40 years. Cassie had always been curious, the type to seek out the unknown, to test her limits. When she heard the church was open to the public, she decided she'd go explore it, alone, on a cold autumn evening. There was no reason to believe the rumors, just tales spun from the boredom of small-town life. Still, something in her gut told her to be cautious. But she shrugged it off, eager to see the inside. As she made her way up the hill, the church stood like a shadow against the twilight sky, its stone walls covered in creeping vines. It had been renovated, but there were parts that still looked weathered and old, as though the building itself had a history it was trying to forget. She opened the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The church was quiet, almost too quiet. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been aired out in years. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she walked down the central aisle, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Tall stained glass windows lined the walls, their colors muted in the fading light. The pews were lined up neatly, though some of them seemed to have strange, unnatural wear, as though they'd been used more recently than anyone cared to admit. Cassie moved toward the altar, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. That's when she saw it. A small wooden door, almost hidden behind the altar. It was cracked open, just slightly, and from it came a faint sound, soft, almost imperceptible at first, like a low hum, a whisper. The longer she stood there, the more it grew, like something was calling her. She wasn't sure why, but she stepped forward, her curiosity outweighing the unsettling feeling that crept along her spine. The door swung open easily, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the dark. The hum became clearer, more distinct, and now Cassie could hear the low sound of chanting coming from somewhere deep below. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her feet moved without her command. She descended the stairs, each step feeling colder than the last, until she reached a heavy wooden door at the bottom. The chanting was louder now, not just a hum, but full words, though she couldn't make them out. With a deep breath, Cassie pushed the door open. The room was vast, carved directly into the earth, with stone walls lined with ancient symbols. Candles flickered along the edges, their flames casting long shadows that seemed to move, flicker in strange ways. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, and on it, a strange, pulsating object, a small black stone, slick and wet, like it had just been pulled from some dark, forgotten place. Around the pedestal, gathered in a circle, were figures, tall, thin, their features hidden by dark robes. They didn't move or speak as Cassie entered, but the chanting continued, rising in pitch, louder now, as if they were aware of her presence. Suddenly, the stone in the center of the room cracked open, and what emerged from it wasn't human. The creature was a swirling mass of blackness, shifting and undulating, its eyes like voids, endless pits of darkness. It let out a low, guttural sound that shook Cassie to her core, sending a wave of nausea over her. The figures around her began to chant faster, their voices growing frantic. They raised their hands toward the creature, as if they were trying to summon it, or perhaps control it. Cassie turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her, and the room filled with a deafening sound, like hundreds of voices screaming in agony. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air turning thick and suffocating. The chanting reached a fever pitch. The creature, now fully formed, stretched its tendrils toward her, its presence suffocating, overwhelming. Cassie gasped for air, her legs weak beneath her. She turned to the stone pedestal, and that's when she saw it, a crack in the stone floor, dark and wide. Without thinking, she bolted toward it, hoping for escape. But the moment she stepped onto the crack, everything stopped. The chanting ceased. The room fell silent. The creature was gone. Cassie found herself alone in the church once more. The heavy wooden door at the bottom of the stairs opened before her. She stumbled back up the stairs, confused, dizzy, her heart racing. When she emerged into the church, the air felt cold, still, the sound of her own breath loud in the silence. But when she turned to leave, she saw something on the back of the altar. The wooden door that had been cracked open earlier was now closed tight, the symbol of a dark eye carved into it. And on the door, etched into the wood, were the same symbols she had seen in the room below. Cassie fled from the church, the full moon casting long, twisted shadows over the hill as she ran. She never spoke about what happened that night. And when she tried to revisit the church the next day, the doors were locked tight. No one was allowed in. And the people of Alderbrook? They say the church has been closed for years, just like it had been before. No one can say why. But sometimes, on quiet nights, they hear strange sounds coming from the hill. The hum of chanting, the rustling of robes, as though something is waiting. And they know better than to go looking for it.
Story number 6.
It was late when Noah found himself standing in front of the old cabin deep in the woods, the last remnants of daylight slipping behind the horizon. He had been hiking for hours, his phone long since lost its signal, and now the forest around him seemed unnervingly still. The cabin, hidden between the towering pines and thick underbrush, looked abandoned. The windows were covered with grime, and the door hung ajar, creaking ever so slightly in the breeze. He had heard rumors about this place, of course. The locals whispered about the man who had lived there long ago, a hermit who disappeared one stormy night without a trace. Some claimed he was a recluse, others said he was hiding from something. But the story that unsettled Noah the most was the one where people claimed to hear voices from the cabin when there was no one inside, and that the forest itself seemed to resist anyone who tried to leave once they'd entered. Noah, of course, wasn't the type to be easily frightened. He was a man of logic, of reason. The idea that a cabin in the woods could be haunted or cursed seemed absurd. He pushed the door open, stepping inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mold and decay hit him immediately. The floor creaked beneath his boots, and a dim light filtered through the grimy windows, casting long, twisted shadows. He walked further into the cabin, noting the overturned furniture, the empty shelves, and the scattered remnants of old belongings, clothes, a chipped cup, a few dog-eared books. But what caught his attention was something in the corner of the room, partially hidden by a long-forgotten curtain. It was an old rocking chair. Noah had no reason to feel uneasy about it at first. It was just a chair, one of those worn wooden ones that had seen better days. But as he stepped closer, he noticed something odd. The chair was moving, slowly creaking back and forth in the silence, as if someone were sitting in it, gently rocking themselves. But when Noah glanced around the room, he saw no one. The chair rocked once more, and Noah froze. It stopped suddenly, and Noah, despite his growing unease, couldn't tear his eyes away from it. The air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. That's when he heard it, a low, raspy voice, barely audible but unmistakably real. Leave. It was a command, a soft but desperate plea that seemed to vibrate through the very air itself. Noah's heart skipped a beat, and his instincts screamed at him to turn around and run. But instead, he took a step closer, compelled by something he couldn't quite explain. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice wavering slightly, betraying the unease creeping up on him. There was no response, just silence. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the rocking chair, his breathing shallow. Then, before he could think, a gust of wind slammed the door shut with a violent thud. Noah spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The door, which had been ajar when he entered, was now firmly shut. Panic surged through him as he rushed to the door, his hands trembling as he tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. The rocking chair began to move again, faster now, the creaking growing louder, more erratic. The same voice whispered, now barely a rasp, "Leave. Now." Noah's mind raced. He needed to get out. This was insane. He tried the door again, pounding on it with all his strength, but it wouldn't open. His panic grew, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then, in the corner of his eye, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure standing in the doorway to another room, watching him. It was a man, thin and gaunt, his face pale and drawn, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through him. His hair was long and matted, and his clothes were torn, as though he had been living in this cabin for far too long. Noah stumbled backward, his heart racing. The figure didn't move, just stood there, its gaze unblinking. Suddenly, the rocking chair stopped. The man stepped forward, his face now inches from Noah's. His voice was a hoarse whisper, but it felt like it was inside Noah's head, reverberating through his very bones. They don't leave. No one leaves. Noah felt his blood turn to ice as the man's hand reached out to him, its fingers long and bony, with nails that seemed to curl unnaturally. Without thinking, Noah grabbed a nearby chair and swung it toward the man, knocking him back. The man let out a low, guttural growl, and his eyes glowed faintly with a pale, unnatural light. His mouth opened wide in a silent scream, and the walls of the cabin seemed to groan as though the very structure of the place were alive and protesting his presence. Noah turned and bolted toward the window, desperate to escape, to break free of whatever was holding him in this place. The glass cracked under his fists as he slammed against it, and he shoved his body through, falling to the ground outside. The cold air hit him like a slap, and he scrambled to his feet, not daring to look back. But as he ran down the path, the sound of the rocking chair's creaking followed him, along with that whisper, softer but clearer now. They don't leave. You'll never leave. Noah didn't stop until he reached the edge of the woods. He didn't dare go back to that cabin, didn't even look over his shoulder. The town would never believe him, he knew that. But from that night on, he never ventured too close to those woods again. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, he could still hear the faintest sound of the rocking chair in the distance. Creaking, always creaking, beckoning him back.
Story number 7.
It was supposed to be a quiet weekend for Emily. She had rented a small cottage by the lake, far from the hustle of the city, hoping for some peace and solitude. The drive up had been long, and the weather was turning gray as she pulled into the gravel driveway. She didn't mind the overcast skies. In fact, it added to the sense of isolation she was craving. But when she stepped out of the car, the air felt unnervingly still, as if the world around her had gone silent in a way that wasn't natural. The cottage itself was charming in a rustic way, nestled among tall pines, with a view of the lake shimmering faintly in the distance. Emily unpacked her things and wandered inside. The cottage smelled of cedarwood, warm and comforting. There was a crackling fireplace in the living room, a cozy chair, and a bookshelf filled with novels she might read. It was perfect. That night, as the storm rolled in, Emily sat by the fire, sipping a glass of wine and reading a book she had brought. The storm rattled the windows and made the trees outside sway violently, but Emily wasn't bothered by it. She enjoyed the sound of the rain against the roof, the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the darkened woods. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, she heard it. A knock at the door. She frowned, confused. No one lived nearby. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the last thing she expected was for someone to be visiting her at this hour, especially in such weather. She stood up slowly, her heartbeat quickening. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 distinct raps. Reluctantly, she walked toward the door, checking the peephole. There was no one there, just the darkened, rain-soaked porch. She could barely see anything through the glass except the blurry silhouette of the trees bending under the wind. Maybe it was a prank, someone trying to scare her. But Emily wasn't the type to jump at shadows. She unlocked the door, peering out into the night. There was no one. Feeling a strange mix of relief and unease, she closed the door and locked it again. Perhaps she had imagined it. She turned back to the fireplace, trying to shake off the creeping sensation that someone was watching her. But just as she was about to sit back down, there was another knock. This time, much more insistent. The hairs on her neck stood up. With growing dread, Emily went to the door once more. She didn't bother checking the peephole this time. She swung the door open quickly, ready to confront whoever had been knocking. There was nothing, just the cold wind and rain sweeping across the porch. But then she noticed something. A small, dirty child's mitten was lying on the porch floor, half covered by rain and mud. Emily's heart skipped. She bent down, picking it up, feeling its worn fabric in her hands. It was old, ragged, as though it had been there for a long time. She couldn't imagine why it would be here, but something about it made her stomach tighten. As she held the mitten, she heard a voice. Soft at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. "Help me." It was a whisper, faint but unmistakable. It seemed to come from the woods, just beyond the reach of the porch light. Emily froze, the mitten slipping from her hands and falling to the ground. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. "Help me," the voice repeated, closer now. It was the voice of a child, a young, desperate voice. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Who's there? Is someone out there?" For a moment there was only silence. Then, just as Emily was about to turn back inside, she heard it again, louder this time. "Help me, please." This time it came from directly behind her. Emily whipped around, her breath catching in her throat. The porch light flickered and then went out, plunging her into darkness. The wind howled, and the rain beat against the cottage like the pounding of fists. She could hear faint footsteps in the mud, slow and heavy, but they were coming closer. "Hello?" she shouted, backing toward the door, her heart hammering in her chest. There was no reply, only the sound of the steps growing louder. Then, a hand reached out from the darkness. Emily screamed and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she leaned against the door, her back pressed against it as if she could keep whatever it was on the other side from getting in. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. A child's voice. Footsteps. A hand. She glanced toward the window. The rain was coming down harder now, obscuring her view. But she could swear she saw a figure standing just beyond the glass, barely visible in the storm, staring in at her. It was a child, small, drenched, its face pale and featureless, its eyes black holes that seemed to stare directly into her soul. Emily backed away, her pulse racing. She turned to the phone, her hands shaking as she reached for it. But the screen flickered and died before she could dial. The storm raged on. The wind howled louder. Suddenly, the door rattled. Someone, or something, was trying to get in. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. The knocking came again, rapid and frantic, desperate, as though whatever was outside had lost patience. "Help me," the voice begged. "Help me, please." And then there was a crash. The door splintered and a cold wind rushed in, blowing the flames in the fireplace out, casting the room into darkness. Emily's last breath was a whispered cry as the thing that had been knocking at the door stepped inside. No one knows what happened to Emily. The next day, when a neighbor came to check on her, the cottage was empty. The door was wide open, the windows shattered, and the place was filled with a sense of oppressive stillness. They never found Emily, but they did find something strange, the small child's mitten lying on the porch, soaked through with rain.
Story number 8.
Cameron had always been the adventurous type. Growing up in the city, he often felt confined by the walls around him, both physical and societal. So, when he decided to take a solo trip out to the mountains far from civilization, he was filled with a sense of freedom, the kind he hadn't experienced in years. He'd been planning the trip for weeks, mapping out the trails, finding the perfect secluded cabin. And now, here he was, standing on the porch of the little cabin he'd rented for the weekend. The air was crisp, the sky a deep blue, and the pine trees surrounding him swayed gently in the wind. Cameron smiled to himself, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in ages. The silence was profound, so different from the hum of the city. After settling into the cabin, Cameron decided to take a walk around the nearby woods. The area was remote, the nearest neighbors miles away, and the thought of being completely alone felt oddly liberating. He wandered deeper into the forest, following a small trail that led toward a creek he had read about in a guidebook. The sound of his boots crunching against the dried leaves was the only noise, accompanied by the occasional bird call. After some time, he came across a small clearing. It was peaceful, just a stretch of grass with wildflowers and a few large rocks scattered around. But as he looked closer at one of the rocks, something caught his eye. There were markings on it, odd symbols carved deep into the stone. At first, Cameron thought it was just some old graffiti, but the shapes were too deliberate, too intricate to be random. Curiosity piqued. He knelt down and ran his fingers over the carvings. They were cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so, as if the rock had been chilled by something unseen. As he traced the symbols, a sharp pain shot through his hand. He recoiled, blinking in confusion. There was nothing sharp on the stone. He looked at his palm. It was red, irritated, and there on his skin were deep, angry scratches that hadn't been there before. Frowning, Cameron stood up, shaking off the feeling of unease that crept over him. He decided it was best to head back to the cabin, but as he turned around, the forest around him seemed different. The trees were taller, their branches thick and dark. The path he had walked seemed to have shifted, narrowing and twisting, as though the woods themselves were rearranging. He called out to himself, laughing nervously. "It's just the isolation, getting to me," he muttered. But the trees didn't seem to listen. The silence had deepened, pressing in around him. It wasn't until the sun began to set that Cameron started to feel truly uneasy. The forest, which had once seemed inviting, now felt suffocating. The shadows grew long and stretched unnaturally. He glanced at his phone. No signal. That was expected, given how far out he was, but the absence of any connection to the outside world felt more oppressive than he remembered. The trail seemed endless, and the strange feeling in his chest grew heavier. As night fell, the air turned colder, the woods darker. Cameron quickened his pace, but the trail seemed to mock him, growing more twisted and unfamiliar with every turn. And then he saw it. In the distance, through the trees, a faint light flickered. At first, he thought it might be the cabin, but the light was too far off, too low. It wasn't the warm glow of a home. It was flickering, erratic, like a candle in the wind. He squinted, trying to make sense of it, but the shadows seemed to distort, playing tricks on his eyes. A voice called out, soft at first, but unmistakable. "Help me." It was faint, like a whisper in the wind, but it was there. A child's voice, distant and desperate. Cameron froze. His first instinct was to ignore it, to keep walking, but something pulled at him, drawing him toward the sound. He followed the light, the voice growing clearer with each step. As he approached, the light suddenly dimmed, flickering out, but the voice continued, now louder, more frantic. "Help me. Please, I'm scared." Cameron reached the source of the light, a small clearing where an old wooden shack stood, half ruined and covered in vines. The door was slightly ajar, and the faintest glimmer of light seemed to seep through the cracks. The voice was louder now, echoing from inside the shack. Without thinking, he pushed open the door. It creaked in protest, but he stepped inside. The interior was dark, save for the faint glow coming from a single candle in the center of the room. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The walls were covered in strange symbols, similar to the ones he had seen on the rock earlier, but now they were drawn on the walls in dark, uneven strokes. "Hello?" Cameron called out. His voice felt foreign in the stillness. "Is anyone here?" The candle flickered again, and for a moment the room seemed to shift. The shadows stretched and twisted unnaturally, as though the walls themselves were moving. And then, in the corner of the room, he saw it, a figure, small, pale, crouched on the floor, rocking back and forth. Its face was hidden in the darkness, but Cameron could hear the soft sobs, the raspy breathing. He stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure didn't seem to notice him, its movements mechanical and slow. "Hey, are you okay?" Cameron asked, his voice shaking now. The figure lifted its head, revealing a face that was both childlike and twisted, as though it had been stretched too far, its eyes hollow and dark, its mouth split in a grin that was too wide. The smile was wrong. It was wide enough to swallow the entire room. The voice that had been crying out now whispered, too close to his ear, "You shouldn't have come here. No one ever leaves." Before Cameron could react, the door slammed shut behind him. The candle blew out, plunging the room into pitch blackness. The last thing he heard was the sound of footsteps, no, scraping footsteps, circling him in the dark. And then the world went silent. The next morning, the cabin was empty. The door was wide open, the candle on the floor extinguished, and the only trace of Cameron was a single footprint leading into the woods and disappearing into thin air. The locals say the woods have a way of taking people. They don't talk about it much, but every few years someone vanishes, lost forever. The forest doesn't let go. Some say it's the spirits of those who were trapped there. Others say it's something much older. Either way, if you wander too far into those woods, you might never come back. And if you listen closely enough, you can hear the whispers calling to you, just like Cameron did. Help me, please.
Story number 9.
It was well into the night when Josh pulled off the main road and onto the narrow dirt path that would lead him to the old farmhouse he'd rented for the weekend. He'd been looking for a place to escape the stress of his job, a chance to get away from the constant buzz of his phone and the distractions of city life. The farmhouse was perfect, isolated, peaceful, far enough from everything to feel like he was completely alone. As he drove, the trees thickened around him, their branches interlocking like the walls of a dark, suffocating tunnel. The headlights of his car barely cut through the pitch black, the darkness seeming to swallow everything in its path. The thought of the farmhouse ahead should have been comforting, but for some reason, it wasn't. There was a heaviness to the air, a weight that pressed against his chest, making it harder to breathe. When he finally arrived, the house was exactly what he expected: old, weathered, and quiet. The wooden structure creaked under the weight of time, the porch sagging slightly as if it had been standing just a little too long. But Josh didn't mind. It was just him here. He grabbed his bags and headed inside. The house was colder than he expected, the air damp and musty, but still, it had a certain charm. The floors were creaky, the walls lined with old portraits, their eyes watching him wherever he went. He tried not to pay attention to the unsettling feeling creeping up his spine, telling himself it was just the solitude getting to him. After unpacking, he went to bed early, hoping to get some much-needed rest. But sleep didn't come easily. The wind outside howled like a distant, mournful cry, and the house seemed to groan with every gust. The old floorboards creaked as though someone or something was moving about in the house. Josh told himself it was nothing. The house was just old. It was just the wind, but the sound persisted. At some point, Josh drifted off, only to be awakened by a strange noise. It was coming from the hallway outside his bedroom door. Soft, hesitant footsteps, the kind of footsteps someone would make if they were trying not to be heard. Josh froze, his heart beginning to pound in his chest. It was late. The house was supposed to be empty. Who could it be? He listened intently, trying to hear through the thick silence. The footsteps stopped right outside his door. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then the door slowly creaked open, just a crack. Josh could barely make out the shadow of a figure standing in the doorway, but he couldn't see any details, only a vague silhouette. His mind raced, wondering if it was someone who had broken in, someone trying to steal something. But then, to his horror, the figure spoke. "Help me." It was a whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. The voice was thin, strained, as though the person could barely summon the energy to speak. Josh didn't move. His body felt frozen, his throat tight. He couldn't bring himself to speak, couldn't bring himself to do anything except listen to the soft, labored breathing that followed the whisper. "Please," the voice continued, growing fainter. "Help me." He knew he should get up, should shout, should do something, but he couldn't. The fear held him in place, rooted to the bed, unable to break free from the paralysis that gripped him. And then, as quickly as it had come, the voice stopped. The door creaked shut. Josh lay there in the dark, the silence pressing in on him like a thick blanket. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that? What did they want? Why didn't they say anything more? He waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing came. The house was eerily still, almost too still. Then finally, he forced himself to get up. He had to check. He had to make sure he wasn't imagining things. He crept out of bed and slowly, cautiously walked to the door. It was dark in the hallway, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon outside the window. The air felt colder now, and Josh shivered involuntarily as he stepped into the hall. The house was silent again, too silent. Josh crept down the hall, his footsteps muffled by the old carpet beneath him. As he passed the open door of the guest bedroom, something caught his eye. The bed was perfectly made. No one had been sleeping there. He shook his head. Maybe it had all been a dream. But then he turned to leave and froze in place. The door at the end of the hall, leading down to the basement, was cracked open. Josh didn't remember leaving it open. He didn't remember even walking past it. But there it was, a sliver of darkness, almost beckoning him to come closer. He swallowed hard. The basement was a place he had avoided when he first arrived, not because it was particularly scary, but because it had that same oppressive feel that seemed to permeate the house. The thought of going down there now after everything made his skin crawl. But that voice had to come from somewhere. He had to know. Taking a deep breath, he moved toward the basement door. With every step, his heartbeat pounded louder in his ears. When he reached the door, he hesitated, but then pushed it open. The air was cold, damp, and smelled faintly of rot. He descended the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under his weight. The basement was just as he remembered, cramped, dark, with only a single light bulb dangling from the ceiling, its dim light casting long, twisting shadows. And then he saw it. In the far corner of the room, standing motionless in the darkness, was a figure. A woman, her face pale and gaunt, her hair hanging in tangled strands over her face. She stood perfectly still, her body hunched in a strange, unnatural way. Her clothes were ragged, torn at the edges, as though they had been worn for years. Josh's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't moving. But then her head turned slowly, and her eyes, black as pitch, locked onto his. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice a hollow, broken echo. Josh wanted to run, to scream, but his legs wouldn't move. He was frozen in place, watching as the woman stepped toward him, her movements jerky, unnatural. Each step was accompanied by a creak, like the sound of a door long unused. When she was close enough, she reached out, her hand cold and clammy as it touched his arm. "Please, help me," she begged once more, her voice now filled with desperation. And in that moment, Josh understood. He wasn't the first. There had been others before him. "Help me," she repeated, her fingers tightening around his arm, pulling him toward the dark corner of the basement where shadows seemed to move on their own. Josh never made it out of the basement. The next morning, when the authorities arrived, they found the house empty, except for a few old, tattered photographs on the walls. And on the basement door, carved deep into the wood, were the words, "Help me." Some say if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers calling from the woods at night. "Help me, they beg. And if you're unlucky, you'll be the next one to answer.
Story number 10.
The small town of Briarwood had always been a quiet, uneventful place. Everyone knew each other, and the streets were always calm. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, until the day Rachel moved in. Rachel had been looking for a fresh start. The bustling city had worn her down, and she longed for peace, for solitude. So when she found a modest cottage on the edge of Briarwood, she jumped at the opportunity. The cottage was old but charming, nestled in a secluded area surrounded by thick trees and rolling hills. There was no one nearby, which was exactly what she wanted. The first few days were idyllic. Rachel spent her time unpacking and settling into the cottage, enjoying the serenity that the quiet town provided. But as the days passed, something started to feel off. It was subtle at first, a flicker in the corner of her eye, the sound of footsteps on the floorboards when she was certain she was alone. She chalked it up to the house settling or her imagination running wild. But then the dreams began. At night, Rachel would lie in bed, her body heavy with exhaustion, only to be awakened by whispers, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the walls. She would sit up in bed, listening intently, but the whispers would stop the moment she opened her eyes. Sometimes she would hear the creak of the floorboards, like someone was moving through the house, but when she checked, there was no one there. One night, after weeks of restless sleep, Rachel woke up to the distinct sound of someone breathing. Slow, shallow breaths that seemed to come from just beside her bed. Her heart raced, her breath catching in her throat. She dared not move, too afraid to even turn her head. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as though something was looming just out of her sight. When she finally gathered the courage to look, there was no one. The room was empty, just as it should have been. She sat up, her hands trembling, and looked around the dark room, her eyes scanning every corner. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her mind reeling with the unexplainable sensation that someone was watching her. The next day, Rachel decided to speak with the townspeople. She needed to know if anyone else had experienced anything strange. As she walked into the small diner in the center of town, she noticed the locals whispering amongst themselves. The chatter ceased when she walked in, and a few pairs of eyes shifted toward her. She ordered a coffee and tried to strike up a conversation with the waitress, a woman named Clara, who seemed a little too nervous for Rachel's liking. "Have you been here long?" Clara asked, her voice thin. "Not really," Rachel replied, stirring her coffee. "I just moved into that old cottage by the woods, the one on the edge of town." Clara's expression faltered. "That cottage? It's been empty for a long time. People don't usually stay there." Rachel frowned. "Why not? It's a lovely place." Clara hesitated, glancing around the room before leaning closer. "There's a story about that place. Some say it's cursed. It's been empty for years because, well, people say it's haunted." Rachel let out a nervous laugh. "Haunted? By what?" Clara shook her head. "I don't know, but there's an old legend in this town. A long time ago, a family lived in that house. They were quiet people, but strange things started happening. People would hear voices at night, footsteps when no one was around. It got worse over time until one night the whole family disappeared. No one ever saw them again. After that, the house was abandoned, and it's been empty ever since." Rachel's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, disappeared?" Clara lowered her voice. "No one knows. It's like they just vanished, left everything behind, the furniture, their clothes, even food still on the table. Like they just walked out the door and never came back." Rachel tried to brush it off as an old town legend, but that night she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Her dreams had become darker, more vivid. In them, she would walk through the cottage, the walls whispering her name, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. Sometimes she would hear footsteps behind her, but when she turned around, no one would be there. One night, Rachel woke up to the sound of footsteps again, this time unmistakably close. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and listened. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking around her room. She couldn't see anyone, but the pressure in the room grew heavier. The whispers returned, louder this time, murmuring her name in a language she couldn't understand. She tried to call out, but her voice caught in her throat. Her body was paralyzed, unable to move as the air thickened around her. The footsteps stopped right beside her bed, and then the whisper came again, clear as day. "Help us." The voice was different this time, pleading, desperate. It felt as if the words were not just spoken, but implanted into her mind, wrapping around her thoughts like a vice. Rachel finally mustered the strength to move, jumping out of bed and running to the door. As she flung it open, she was met with an overwhelming sense of dread. The entire hallway was dark, the shadows seeming to stretch and shift unnaturally. She turned back toward her bedroom, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the hallway. She reached for her phone, but it was dead. No signal. It was as if the house itself was blocking her from the outside world. Panic surged through her as she realized she couldn't escape. The whispers grew louder, filling her ears, a cacophony of voices begging for release. She stumbled down the stairs and out the front door, running into the woods behind the cottage. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches twisting like gnarled hands. And that's when she saw it. Just beyond the tree line, the faint outline of a figure standing motionless, staring at her. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the figure was wearing clothes she had seen before, clothes that looked like the ones the family had left behind. The figure moved toward her, the footsteps unmistakable. They were slow, deliberate, just like the ones in her dreams. Rachel turned and ran, her legs pumping furiously, but the figure followed her, gaining on her with every step. She stumbled over roots, branches slapping her face, but no matter how fast she ran, she could hear the footsteps behind her. And then just before she thought she might escape, the whisper came again. "Help us." The last thing Rachel saw before everything went black was the shadow of the figure stretching across the ground, its arms reaching for her. The next morning, the townspeople found the cottage empty, with the door wide open. The only sign of Rachel was a single footprint leading into the woods and disappearing without a trace. No one ever saw her again, but they say if you listen closely, if you stand near the edge of the woods on a quiet night, you can hear the whispers. "Help us! Help us!" And if you're unlucky enough to listen for too long, you might feel the cold fingers of the past reach out, just like Rachel did. Help us.